Good evening and welcome to another session at LHI Circle. We have a very special guest today and a very interesting book. It wasn't the first attempt at telling the story of the Buddha and taking it to the world. Yet the Light of Asia was quite a spectacular success. In today's parlance, it is a book or a work that went viral and introduced the Buddha to the Western world. Why did that happen? What was so special about this book? That's the question that Jairam Ramesh, renowned author, and of course, we know him as ex-minister, Rajya Sabha member, and politician. He's tried attempted to find out the reason behind the Light of Asia's success. Remember, it was a poem by Sir Edwin Arnold, published in the late 19th century. And in many senses, it kind of acted as a milestone in our understanding or appreciation of the Buddhist world, because it actually had such a cascading impact beyond. Jairam Ramesh joins us now. Many thanks for joining us. Mr. Ramesh, last time we spoke, we were talking about Krishna Menon at the Kala Ghoda festival. And I must tell you, I was completely blown away by this book, because I've always seen you from a journalist's vantage point talking about politics, economics, or the making of India post 1991. So I was very pleasantly surprised by this book. So my first question is, what made you go on a quest in search of the Light of Asia and the backstory to it?
Well, the life of the Buddha, has fascinated me, captivated me. It captivates all Indians. Buddha is hardwired into the Indian DNA, so to speak. And I've always been interested. I'm not a Buddhist or a scholar of Buddhism by any means, but the life of the Buddha has held special meaning for me, as it does, as I said, for almost all Indians. And this was a poem that I read when I was a child, when I was very young, and it remained with me. And over the years, as I read more about Buddhism and the life of the Buddha, out of sheer intellectual interest, I began to be aware of the importance of this poem. It was a milestone in Buddhist historiography. It was published in 1879. And as you very rightly said, it went viral. In 1879, it went viral in England, it went viral in Europe, it went viral in America, and it went super viral in Asia, in China, Japan, Korea, Ceylon, Siam, Thailand, today's Thailand, and of course, India. So this was an attempt on my part to understand why this book, why this poem exercised such an extraordinary influence on our thinking and on our understanding and on our appreciation of the life of Buddha. Now, this is a two-in-one biography, Minnie. It's a biography of the poem, but it's also a biography of the author. I can't divorce the poet from the poem. And the author is also a fascinating character. A great believer in British rule in India, a Victorian imperialist in every sense of the term, but completely in love with India's civilization legacy. He translated the Hitopadesha, he translated the Mahabharata, he translated the Gita Govinda, and most importantly, Minnie, in 1885, he translated the Bhagavad Gita as the song Celestial, which became one of the defining texts for Mahatma Gandhi for the rest of his life.
Right.
So I set out to discover why the poem was influential, The Light of Asia, and I also set out to unravel the life of this curiously ambivalent, Orientalist of the late 19th century.
Right. And as you point out, there's just been one biography, I think, of Edwin Arnold, but I really found it fascinating because there are many interesting aspects. The first is, of course, he came to India around 1857. He was a principal of the Deccan College, a place that I love because it's now the Deccan College of Archaeology. But that apart, his life is so interesting because he was, and I have a separate list of questions for the body of work he did across philosophies, which is just mind-blowing. But what is also interesting about this man is that he was a journalist, he was a poet, and he almost became the poet laureate under the Victorian administration after the death of Lord Tennyson. And he packed in so much in his life. So what was he like as a person? Because before I talk about the Light of Asia, let's talk about how he got to the Light of Asia.
Well, he came to India in 1857, November of 1857, and stayed here for 26 months as principal of Poona College, which later became the Deccan College. He obviously had a remarkable, felicity with languages: Greek, Latin, French, German, Persian, but most importantly for our conversation, Sanskrit and Marathi. He fell in love with these languages, became proficient in these two languages. And as principal of Deccan College, of Poona College, really became aware of India's literary treasures, literary classics, and fell in love with India's cultural legacy, which he defined as a composite legacy. He translates what are quote unquote Hindu works. He's written this great epic poem on the life of the Buddha, and he also translated from the Arabic, which he knew, the 99 names of Allah. So, his trilogy was translations of what are we consider to be Hindu works, like the Gita Govinda, Hitopadesha, Mahabharata, the Bhagavad Gita. Then, of course, the Light of Asia, which is, to deal with the life of Buddha, and the 99 names of Allah. So he was a journalist. He was not an academic. He was not a scholar by any means. He was the editor of the Daily Telegraph for over 25 years, a very influential journalist. The poets didn't think much of him. They thought of him as a minor poet because he, dabbled in Orientalism far too much. Most of his poems were not in English. I mean, they were in English, but they were translations of Sanskrit, Persian, or Arabic, or Turkish, for that matter. He was married 3 times. He fell in love with a Japanese who was 37 years younger to him, and the last 10 years of his life, she lived with him, and she of course passes away only in 1962, outlived him by almost 55, 56 years. So he became a great lover of Japanese culture for the last 10, 15 years of his life, like he was a lover of Indian culture. So obviously, he was a Victorian. He lived in London. He epitomized all the great Victorian values, the believer in the Raj, believer in the modernizing mission of the British establishment in the subcontinent. But at the same time, a great popularizer of India's cultural and literary legacy.
Right.
So I find him very ambivalent, and this is where I part company with my friend Shashi Tharoor. Shashi Tharoor condemns that whole generation of Britishers as imperialists and colonialists. But I think there were, in the 19th century, a generation of Britishers who were imperialists and colonialists, no doubt, but at the same time were steeped in Indian culture, were steeped in Indian literary, and cultural heritage, art, architecture, music, painting, texts. And Edwin Arnold epitomized that. Today, the word Orientalist is a bad word, but he was an Orientalist in the best sense of the term in the late 19th century.
I must tell you, I agree with you, because I think even in the field of archaeology, for instance, John Marshall, all of these greats, I mean, we owe a lot to them. Of course,
you have William Jones, you have Monia Williams, you have Paul
a whole
Cook,
bunch of them
John
did some
Marshall.
seminal work. Absolutely.
So I don't think these guys sat down. I don't think Edwin Arnold sat down and said, now, how do I write a poem on the life of the Buddha to justify British rule in India? This is where Shashi and I differ. I think there were people who were, they were genuine in their scholarship. They may have had a belief in British imperialism and British colonialism, but that should not blind us to the fact that these are the people whom we owe a huge debt of gratitude. for rediscovering what we have ourselves forgotten over the centuries.
Right. When I was reading about Edwin Arnold, I couldn't but think, he was a journalist, so he obviously had a great way of writing, but he had to have a very deep sense of philosophy and understanding of it to be able to do the body of work he did, because it wasn't just a literary classic, it was also summarizing and beautifully putting together the philosophy, the complex philosophy, the complex web of philosophies across faiths, because as you rightly said, it started with Gita Govindam. We went to the Light of Asia, talked about Islam, went to the song Celestial, which is a Bhagavad Gita. Now, each one was very deep in their own sense. So when you were working on him, what sense did you get of the man? Because,
well, he was obviously, he was a doubting Thomas when it came to the church. He was deeply, deeply, he was not steeped in Christianity. In fact, he was criticized for writing The Light of Asia, and to compensate to meet that criticism and to bolster his credentials to be the poet laureate after Lord Tennyson, he wrote another long epic poem called Light of the World on the life of Christ. And that book completely bombed. It just didn't take off. So the appetite in the 19th century was not for Christ. The appetite in the late 19th century was for a Buddha-like figure, a figure whom people could relate to, as a moral anchor, as a spiritual anchor, as a philosophical anchor, but not as somebody who was preaching a dogma or a creed or was imposing an institution like the church or the Pope, and clearly the sense I got from, reading Edwin Arnold's papers and his correspondence, which are scattered all over the world in different archives, is a man, great believer in science. This was also the period, many remember, the late 19th century. This is the post-Darwin period. This is the period in which science is progressing rapidly. There is growing doubt on Christianity, on organized church. And this was also the period of growing economic prosperity in the West particularly. I'll come to India separately, but I think the reason why this poem really became a sensation in India is somewhat different than what happened in the West. In the West, there was a hunger, there was an appetite for a Buddha-like figure. And remember that the 19th century was also the century of poems, of long poetry. The poets were knighted, authors were not knighted. Edwin Arnold is Sir Edwin Arnold. Charles Dickens is not Sir Charles Dickens. He was just Charles Dickens. It was not Sir Charles Dickens. It was Sir Lord Tennyson. It was Sir Edwin Arnold. So there was something about poetry. And poetry was very much part of the empire, empire thinking, empire project, empire enterprise. Of course, all that is over. That I'm talking now of the late 19th century. So I was a romantic, great believer in science, as I said. And I think he was not a Buddhist. He was certainly not a Buddhist. He didn't formally become a Buddhist. But amongst all the faiths that he was aware of, I think he was most attracted to the life of the Buddha. Because he saw the Buddha as a logician, as a man. Remember, the Buddha didn't become the Buddha by following a Buddha. Buddha said, be your own master, be your own light, be your own path giver. And I think that's what Edwin Arnold really related to.
Right. Let's come to the text of The Light of Asia, right? What do you think made it go viral? What was the secret sauce over there? What was the ingredient? Because, after reading a book, I went back to The Light of Asia and I was reading it. It's beautifully written. It's absolutely full of great visualization of the period, etc. But for you, what do you think worked in the book?
Remember, I think the reason why the book became viral was it didn't focus on the divinity of Buddha. It focused on the humanity of Buddha. It focused on the life of the Buddha. The birth of Siddhartha, the growing up of Siddhartha, the marriage of Siddhartha, The living, the way Siddhartha discovered the path for himself and ultimately became the Buddha at Bodh Gaya. So this is that story, and it's a story that ends, of course, with the message, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, the path of Nirvana, and so on. So he captures that life very well. Secondly, I think the great contribution that Edwin Arnold did was to demystify the concept of Nirvana. Buddhism was seen to be, and Nirvana particularly was seen to be a nihilistic, negative, defeatist concept which involved withdrawing from the world. But in the poem, that message comes out of Nirvana, is be in the world, but not of the world. And you can attain Nirvana while being in the world, but not necessarily of the world. So Nirvana becomes a very active, concept, not a nihilistic, soul-destroying, life-destroying concept, of which there was this popular perception in the 19th century as Buddha was being discovered. So this was, I think, the second great contribution that he did. Thirdly, of course, it was a beautiful poem. I mean, some of the verses, and I'll read out the last couple of verses. Really beautiful, and they've stuck for generations. I mean, this is a poem that was published in 1879. Still gets translated. It was translated into all European languages. It's been translated into all Asian languages, and it's been translated into all Indian languages. Now, which brings me to the point, why did this poem become such a phenomenon in India? And I think the answer to that question is twofold. There was Vivekananda, there was Gandhi, there was Nehru, there was Tagore. These people got enamored of the poem because they were enamored of the Buddha. Buddha as a cultural figure, as a philosophical figure, as a spiritual figure. However, this was also the time of social revolution in Malabar, in Travancore. This was the time of the social revolution in the Madras presidency. This was the time of social revolution in the Bombay presidency. Now, to these social reformers, Narayana Guru, for example, in Kerala, or Dharmanand Kosambi and Dr. Ambedkar in Maharashtra, to this generation of social reformers in the early 20th century, the poem became an inspirational text because of the message of caste equality, because there's a whole section in the poem which deals very beautifully with how Siddhartha, is feeling very thirsty, and there is a boy who wants to give him water, but the boy is reluctant to give him the water because he's untouchable boy. And Siddhartha says, "Why are you afraid?" And the boy explains, and then Siddhartha explains to the boy that these are all meaningless, and that please give me, please, let you pour the water into my mouth. So this untouchable boy, the untouchable is a word that here Edwin Arnold uses. He pours the water, and Siddhartha's thirst is satiated. So the message which this generation of Indians drew was the message of social reform, the message of abolition of caste barriers, which Buddha advocated. So this is the other reason why the poem got translated into all Indian languages and became an iconic text for social reformers. Right. Remember, for Gandhi, Tagore, Nehru, Vivekananda, it was an iconic text because of its literary and cultural and spiritual value. But for Ambedkar, for Narayana Guru, for E.O.T. Thas, and for Dharmanand Kosambi, it was an iconic text because of the social content, which of Buddha, which Edwin Arnold brought out in beautiful poetry, not in prose.
So I must say there was a certain obsession with Buddhism and the Buddha and Buddhist stupas in that period. You see, from Alexander Cunningham to pretty much all the archaeologists, the great search was for the Buddhist stupas, which is very interesting. But I must come to a related question. You have an Andrew Carnegie, American industrialist, capitalist, as far as they go. him getting inspired by this poem. You have the King of Thailand actually sending a personal note to Edwin Arnold saying that, I mean, I'm just blown by what you have written. So this obviously touched a chord with of
It touched the chord
different
because
people in a different way.
it touched the chord because the subject touched the chord. Because the life of the Buddha. See, Buddha was being rediscovered in the 19th century.
Yeah.
First there was the epigraphical discovery. Then Alexander Cunningham and did his phenomenal archaeological discoveries. And then Edwin Arnold, and then of course you had Max Muller and Rhys Davids who do the textual discoveries. But Edwin Arnold is the first man who brings the epigraphical, the archaeological, the textual all together in this poem. And in fact, none of the academic works of the 19th century still, people have forgotten. They never sold. But this poem became a bestseller. It was not a scholarly poem, but it drew from scholarly works. And he popularized the life of the Buddha. I think the reason why Andrew Carnegie and a whole host of Rudyard Kipling, Leo Tolstoy, a whole host of literary figures and scientific figures who became fascinated with this poem was because they were fascinated by the life of the Buddha. Buddha became really it was a world phenomenon. He became, beginning somewhere in the 1870s, 1880s, and it has continued. Of course, in today's day and age, it has been kept alive because of the Dalai Lama. But long before the Dalai Lama became a global celebrity, Buddha had been absorbed into the consciousness of thinking in the West. And of course, in India, in the subcontinent, Buddha became a figure who was absorbed by our leadership as a way of demonstrating to the white man that we may be politically subjugated, but we are culturally superior to you. We are spiritually superior to you. We are, we are philosophically superior to you because 2000 years ago, we had this personality called the Buddha. So
Right.
you see, Buddha became an iconic figure in the world to different people for different reasons.
While you pull out the excerpt to read, which kind of exemplifies the beauty of the writing, I must quote what Edwin Arnold's son, Julian Arnold, said about the writing of The Light of Asia. And it was really amazing because he says, and I quote, "My father wrote Light of Asia to unwind and get his mind off politics and uncurl his brain after he wrote thundering editorials as a wartime editor." Now, this actually makes him even more of a genius because, imagine, doing a day job and coming in the evening and writing something like The Light of Asia. So,
Yeah,
I mean, it's quite amazing.
He hand wrote it, and I've reproduced some of his handwritten manuscript, which was given to Andrew Carnegie, and then it was bequeathed to the Library of Congress, and I was able to access the original manuscript. It was written over a period of a few months while Edwin Arnold was writing thundering editorials on the Russian-Turkish war that was going on, and he was advocating the cause of Turkey because he saw Turkey as the underdog and Russia as a threat to British rule in India. And he was doing this in the morning and in the evening, going home and writing this 40,000 line poem, epic poem, which is divided into 8 books. But remember, he had to do a lot of reading for this poem. His sources were, English sources, of course, but his sources were also in French, which themselves had been translated from the original Chinese or Pali. There are many Sanskrit texts which are no longer available, but whose Chinese translations are available. And those Chinese translations were then picked up by European scholars and translated into French and thereafter into English. So uh, Edwin Arnold had to really do a lot of reading of these sources. So he really depended on Chinese sources, which had been translated into French and English. He depended on Pali sources, which had been translated into English mainly. And he depended, of course, on some English sources as well. I mean, sources that were in the English language, written by scholars like Max Muller, Rhys Davids, and so on and so forth. So it was a sort of eclectic borrowing. He borrowed from a variety of sources. Uh, it's not the poem is not a reference work, Minnie. It's not a reference work. It's not an academic work. It's not a work of scholarship. But it's a poem that made the Buddha uh, part of the public consciousness, the media interest, the public interest, the interest in, it was made into film in 1925, the first Indo-German film, The Light of Asia in English, Der Lucht ASEAN in German, and Prem Sannyas in Hindi,
Yeah.
starring Himanshu Rai and Reena Devi. So this was, it inspired opera, it inspired film, it inspired drama, and so I think the real reason was that Edwin Arnold was able to distill in this epic poem the essence of the life of the Buddha, and he gave it a very poetic description, much
Right.
better than any scholar would do, any historian would do.
And I think that was the crux of it, because he attempted it with love and passion, and it was out of genuine interest. It was not purely an academic excerpt. But I do want you to read out an excerpt from there, and I also want to remind our attendees that please do ask questions. I will take up your questions. You can put it in the Q&A box, and Mr. Ramesh will answer.
I want to read the last few lines, Millie,
Mm.
because the last few lines are really haunting. And this is, as I said, almost 50,000 lines, and it's divided into 8 books. And this is from book the 8th. This is after he has described the life of Siddhartha, the Siddhartha becoming the Buddha's teachings, 4 truths, eightfold path, nirvana, and so on. And his last lines: "Here endeth what I write, who loved the Master for his love of us. A little knowing, little have I told, touching the teacher and the ways of peace. 45 reigns thereafter showed he those in many lands and many tongues, and gave our Asia light that is still beautiful. Conquering the world with spirit of strong grace, all which is written in the holy books, and where he passed and warred proud emperors, carved his sweet words upon the rocks and caves. And now, in the fullness of the times, it fell, the Buddha died, the great Tathagato, even as a man amongst men, fulfilling all, and how 1,000 lakhs since then have trod the path which leads whither he went, unto nirvana, where the silence lives. Ah, blessed Lord, O high deliverer, forgive the feeble script which doth thee wrong, measuring with little wit thy lofty love. Ah, lover, brother, guide, lamp of the law, I take my refuge in thy name and deed. I take my refuge in thy law of good. I take my refuge in thy order. Om. The dew is on the lotus. Rise, great sun, and lift my leaf and mix me with the wave. Om Mani Padme Hum. The sunrise comes. The dewdrop slips into the shining sea.
Wow.
And this is how it ends.
Yeah.
And in fact, the poem, what the lines that are quoted of the poem are Om Mani Padme Hum, because that's the Tibetan mantra. That's made popular by the Dalai Lama. And the dewdrop, the line on the dewdrop, is just it's really hauntingly beautiful.
Hmm. Tell me, where did the search for Edwin Arnold's story and to find the essence of the Light of Asia take you? Because you've actually dipped into a lot of interesting works. Because yours is not only the story of Edwin Arnold and the Light of Asia, but also of that period. Because a related question is really, I don't know whether a poem of that magnitude would have been that much of a success today. It was a product of its times, wasn't
Yes, I don't think it will be a success today. It won't. It did. It was very much a product of its times,
it?
and there was a hunger for a Buddha-like figure. There was, people were yearning for something to cling on to as a spiritual or a moral anchor. Uh, See, in my view, and I've said so in the book, that one of the reasons why the poem became popular, Buddha didn't preach a new religion. He preached a new morality. He preached a new ethics. He preached a new, way of looking at the world. Basically, he said, I'm not God. I'm not your teacher. You are your own teacher.
Hmm.
And I think that really appealed to the West.
Hmm.
And of course, in the subcontinent, the fact that Buddha took on caste orthodoxy and caste prejudice made him a figure of social revolution. Ultimately, we saw in 1956,
Hmm.
Dr. Ambedkar,
Hmm.
sort of embracing Buddhism in October of 1956 in Nagpur.
Right. And there is a huge revival of Buddhism also
basically,
because of the Ambedkarites. Yeah.
what Dr. Ambedkar repeated the lines, I take my refuge in thy name and thee, Buddham Sharanam Gacchami. I take my refuge in the Lord, Dhammam Sharanam Gacchami. I take my refuge in thy order, Sangham Sharanam Gacchami. So Buddham Sharanam Gacchami, Dhammam Sharanam Gacchami, Sangham Sharanam Gacchami.
Right.
And immediately after Dr. Ambedkar's death in December 1956, his posthumous book, the book that he was working on for many years, was published posthumously, and it was called The Buddha and His Dhamma.
There is a slightly touchy topic about how one sees Buddhism in the context of Hinduism. Okay, now bear with me because I know and I want it to be an academic, except also because of the way people saw it. So Mahatma Gandhi saw it as one, right?
Yes.
Edwin Arnold has a very interesting take on it. He says modern Brahmanism is really Buddhism in a Shastri's robes and sacred thread. And this is a quote that you have put of his, which is also very interesting because how it was perceived and as you said, the fact that he was a reformer was what really touched a nerve. It caught the pulse of the time. So, it requires a little bit of an understanding the way it was perceived.
Well, I have repeatedly said in the book that I'm not getting into a history of Buddhism. Why Buddhism,
Sure. It's more about the perception.
But the fact is, and there are portions of the book where I have explained this. By the 8th century, the Brahmins had appropriated Buddha as one of the avatars of Vishnu. And the earliest epigraphical evidence we have is in Mahabalipuram. This is the late 7th century, early 8th century. And the 12th century text of Jayadeva, Gita Govinda, makes Buddha to be one of the avatars of Vishnu, Gita Govinda, the 9th avatar of Vishnu, which incidentally was translated into English by Sir Edwin Arnold in 1875. Now, the Brahmins adopted Buddha. They didn't make Vardhamana Mahavira into a incarnation of Vishnu. They made Gautam Buddha an incarnation because they saw Buddha and Buddhism as a potent threat to their power in society. But, the Buddhism, in my view, carried the seeds of its own greatness, it had the seeds of its own decline. And over a period of time, it began declining. By the 8th century, Buddha had become the Vishnu avatar, one of the 10 avatars, Vishnu, the ninth one before Kalki comes. And with the coming of Islam, the coup de grace, so to speak, the destruction of Nalanda, and Buddhism really dies out. But long before Islam came to India, Buddhism was getting extinguished. Now, but Buddha didn't get extinguished. This is very important. I make a distinction between Buddha and Buddhism. Buddhism may have got extinguished. Buddhism may have got absorbed in Indian Hindu society, but Buddha remained a figure of inspiration to people across the spectrum, across the religious spectrum, across the class spectrum. It's also very interesting, Mini. In Jayadeva's Geet Govinda, wonderful poem, Buddha becomes an avatar of Vishnu to rid society. See, Vishnu comes as an avatar from time to time to rid society of its evils. Yada yada hi dharmasya glanir bhavati bharata abhyuttanam adharmasya sambhavami. So you see, if there are some ills in society, Vishnu comes. And what is the ill in society that Buddha exterminated? Animal sacrifice. Not caste prejudice, not caste inequality. The Brahmins were not willing to grant him that. That had to await Narayana Guru, Kosambi, Ambedkar, and the 20th century Indians. Buddha was a social reformer because he said no animal sacrifice. That is what is immortalized in Jayadeva's poem.
How interesting.
So, and this debate whether Buddhism is separate from Hinduism, this is a perennial debate. In fact, Vivekananda, there's a wonderful quote of Vivekananda in my book, where Vivekananda says that the Light of Asia is nothing but a Vedantic text. That Buddha was the greatest Vedantic philosopher. So Vivekananda saw him in the Vedanta mold, in the Vedanta tradition.
So we've got some questions from our audiences, or audience members. So I'm going to take this because it's related to Vivekananda and his perception of the Light of Asia. Lauren Michael has this question. It is one thing for Arnold to pen the Light of Asia, but another for an Indian to take the message in person to the heartland of America, Chicago. Now, in 1893, did Vivekananda directly use or cite Arnold's poem as a touchstone of alignment with the American audience? Because Dharmapala was also there. I don't think he...
See, this is the typical Indian, they don't want to see anybody else in 1893 other than Vivekananda. There were two stars in Chicago in 1893. At the World Parliament of Religions, Vivekananda was a superstar. But there was another superstar. It was Angarika Dharmapala. He was also a great superstar. And he created as much of an impact in Chicago as Vivekananda. Now, Vivekananda saw Buddha as a social reformer, as the Martin Luther, so to speak, of Hinduism. He saw Buddhism as Protestant Hinduism in many ways. But Dharmapala saw Buddha as in a completely different way, different tradition. And Dharmapala is considered to be the founder of modern Sinhala nationalism based on aggressive Buddhism. And the story of how the Mahabodhi temple agitation takes place for 60, 70 years, thanks to the Light of Asia, thanks to Edwin Arnold, and thanks to Dharmapala himself. So Vivekananda spoke extensively on the Light of Asia. He spoke extensively on the Buddha, but he saw him, as I said, in this Vedantic framework. He did not see Buddha preaching a separate religion. He saw Buddha as preaching social reform, animal sacrifice. And of course, Vivekananda was a great critic of the caste system. He called the caste system of Kerala a lunatic asylum. Famous words that Vivekananda used. So Vivekananda was a great social reformer, no doubt about it. But he didn't use politics as a vehicle of social reform. The difference is that Ambedkar used politics as an instrument of social reform, whereas Vivekananda was using spirituality as a vehicle of social reform. In any case, Vivekananda died very prematurely and very young. Maybe if he had lived for another 20, 30 years, he would also have, preached, um, in a political, as part of India's political discourse. So this debate will continue, many.
Right. It will continue, but I think it just brings a very varied cast of characters who we must understand to understand that period. We've got an interesting question from Devashish Mahanta, who compliments you, saying that I've always known Jairam sir as an economist and a politician. It feels great to witness a different aspect of him. He's speaking about how he's from Assam, and he says in Assam, which is, of course, primarily Vaishnavite also, Buddha is seen as an avatar of Vishnu. And that's how, it's also a center of great tantric learning, and Buddhist tantricism is also something that went from Bengal to Tibet. But his question is, what are your views on the teachings as propagated by the Buddha a millennium ago? The relevance of it, the fact that in the 19th century, I think in the context of this conversation, that it was revived. Even today, by the way, there's a huge revival of Buddhism, of Buddhist chants. I mean, everywhere across urban India, and I've, borne witness to it across the world, actually. So there is something in his teachings that kind of reconnects with people time and again.
See, for me, the biggest lesson of the Buddha is what I said right at the beginning. The Buddha didn't become a Buddha by following a Buddha. He tried many routes. Self-mortification, for example, he gave up that route, and finally he took the route of reasoning, and that's why I think he appealed to a very large cross-section of society across the world. He was reasoning. It was based on logic. It was based on personal experimentation, and it was a system of ethics and morality. Not a religion, not a creed, not a dogma. So I think there is relevance. There is relevance. See, I am deeply suspicious of all isms. I think divinity divides, humanity unites. And I've said so before, and I don't mind saying it again. India is a divinity surplus country, but a humanity deficit country.
Yeah, absolutely right. Absolutely.
There are far too many gods and goddesses, and far too less people moved by humanity, by humanitarian considerations. Brotherhood, amity, love. Isn't it paradoxical that Sri Lanka, which swears by Buddha, which is wedded to Buddha Shasana, Buddhism is the state religion in many ways. Look at the ethnic strife and look at the social violence in Sri Lanka. Look at what happened in Cambodia under Pol Pot. The Japanese in World War II called themselves the Light of Asia. They used the word Light of Asia for themselves, and they launched on this extraordinary campaign of killing, and extermination of people across Asia. So, more crimes have been committed in the name of religion than in any other name.
Right.
So I am deeply suspicious, and I stay far away from talking about these are private faiths.
Right. We had on
Buddha, the personality, the life of the Buddha is worth studying and worth unraveling.
In fact, we had Professor Charles Hallisey from the Harvard Divinity School speaking about the Harighatas. And one of the things that we were talking about is how Buddhism has so many different dimensions in every country that it went to. It kind of, adopted, adapted, and took in so much of the local culture and became one of its own. So there's a huge difference in the way it is seen.
Chinese are very offended when we say that, Buddha came from India. They think that Buddha was Chinese. The Japanese think that he was Japanese. The Koreans think he was Korean. The Sri Lankans of course, think that he was Sri Lankan. So it's interesting, Buddhism died out in the land of its birth.
Yes.
Of its birth. I didn't say land of Buddha's birth. because there again, India and Nepal, are having an argument on where exactly, Buddha was born. Nepal,
Right.
we've been saying India is but now, of course, we no longer say India is the birthplace of Buddha. We say India is the birthplace of Buddha's teachings, Sarnath and, other places. But it's interesting that Buddhism died out in India, but Buddha didn't die out.
Right.
Buddha remained, and I don't think there is any Indian home, Mini, which does not have this. I'm sure in your house there is
I have one right behind me, so I don't think you can
there
see
is
it
a
on the screen.
painting, there is a tankha, or there is a stone a carving. I mean, every Indian home, for us, Buddha is part of our lives, even
Right.
though we may not be Buddhist in that sense of the term.
Right. Let's get back to the book now. Jaya had a question about what is the most greatest teaching of the Buddha. I think Mr. Ramesh has answered that. But I want to talk about another very interesting aspect, which is Edwin Arnold's meeting with Mahatma Gandhi, which I found very interesting because he was the vice president of the Vegetarians Club that that Gandhi had set up when he was in Bayswater, I think, in England. And that's very interesting. So do we know anything about his interactions with all those people that he inspired?
Well, Gandhi has written in his autobiography that he came to the Bhagavad Gita by reading the song Celestial. And till his death in 1948, he read it every day. He recommended it to his family. He recommended it to his friends. He recommended to all and sundry who wrote to him, asking for, advice. He would say, read the song Celestial. So Gandhi was 20 years old. He was vice president. He was secretary of the London Vegetarian Society, of which the vice president was Edwin Arnold. And Gandhi came to the song Celestial reading in a meeting of the Theosophical Society. And that's where he discovered the Light of Asia as well. The Theosophical Society is a very important institution, which plays a very important role in India's cultural and spiritual and philosophical reawakening in the late 19th and early part of the 20th century. People like Henry Steele Olcott, Blavatsky, but most importantly, we have Annie Besant. I mean, that's a subject for a separate discussion. Yeah, I mean, Gandhi, there's nothing written on Arnold's side. Whatever we have is in Gandhi's collected works. Gandhi spoke extensively on the Light of Asia. He spoke extensively on Edwin Arnold's translation of the Mahabharata, which he read when he was in South Africa. And of course, till his last day, he was quoting from the song Celestial, and that's what I found very interesting, that Gandhi, what was Gandhi's message, Mini? Gandhi's message was fight British rule, don't fight the Britisher, some of Gandhi's best friends were Britishers, he taught us to hate British rule. He did not teach us to hate the Britishers. And that is one, I think, a remarkable, principle that Gandhi adopted. And that's why Nehru could spend 10 years in jail. Nehru, out of 24 years, from 1922 to 1947, or in 25 years of his pre-prime ministerial life, he spent 10 years in jail. And yet, he had, little bitterness or hate or antagonism towards the British. In fact, one of the, in the first chapter of my book, I have quoted 2 letters from Winston Churchill to Nehru, written in 1955.
And referring to the Light of Asia.
Yeah, where Churchill is reminding Nehru about the Light of Asia. Now, Churchill is the man who put Nehru into jail, in 1942 for 2.5 years, the longest period he was in jail, after the Quit India movement.
Yes.
And in 1955, we have Churchill writing to Nehru and Nehru replying. And part of the letter deals with the Light of Asia, which I found, absolutely fascinating.
We often forget, and I think books like yours remind us of the journey as well of modern India, because the whole movement around the Bodh Gaya site, the temple,
Yes, very
is
important.
such a fascinating story, because
Yeah, yeah.
it took 50 years to come through. I know, because I've been to Sarnath and I've been to Bodh Gaya, and I've seen how the Bodhi Society, Mahabodhi
Yes,
Society has worked on these places. Dharmapala was very closely involved. He drove it. Edwin Arnold kind of, inspired it and also supported it. Nehru was a big votary of it. But that whole journey, you must explain to us how, when Edwin went, and when Dharmapala went, the Bodh Gaya site was actually a Shaivite temple.
yes.
And
It
it was
was
through
a
patient
70-year agitation.
persuasion that it was turned into the great
It was
Mahabodhi
a
temple.
70-year agitation, Mini, over the Mahabodhi temple, which is the place where Buddha, where Siddhartha became the Buddha, the
Mm.
enlightenment, and it was also the place where Ashoka had supposed to have installed the Vajrasana. It's a long and convoluted story, but from the early 17th century, it had become a Shaivite temple. It was under the control of the Mahants, plus about 30,000 acres of land. The largest landlord he was. And Edwin Arnold goes to Bodh Gaya in 1886, and becomes completely appalled by the way this hallowed place, what he calls the Mecca for the Buddhists, is being treated. He starts a campaign for transferring the control of the Mahabodhi temple from the Shaivites to the Mahabodhi Society, which had been started by Dharmapala in Calcutta. And this takes 70 years. And finally, in 1953, the control of the Mahabodhi temple, it's a typical Indian 50-50 solution. It is transferred from the Shaivite Mahant to a management committee, 50% of whom would be Hindus and 50% of whom would be Buddhists, represented by the Mahabodhi Society. And the chairman would be the district magistrate of the district of Gaya. This is a typical Indian solution. This was not, still today, it's not accepted by many Ambedkarite Buddhists and many, what you would call in Hindi, Kattar Buddhists. They would want total control. Like it is like Ram Janmabhoomi, like what happened in Ayodhya. They want total control over the Mahabodhi temple. But, Rajendra Prasad, Gandhi, Nehru, all worked towards this negotiated settlement. And finally, in 1953, when the control was transferred from the Shaivites to the management committee, verses from the Light of Asia were recited.
I used to
Can you imagine in May, on the 29th of May 1953, a poem that is written in 1879 is recalled in Bodh Gaya as the control is being transferred from the Mahants to this management committee. Till today, of course, today Bodh Gaya is a World Heritage Site, and you see many Buddhisms in Bodh Gaya. You see Vietnamese, Myanmarese, Sri Lankan, Japanese, Thai, Chinese, Indian. You have all sorts. But the Bodh Gaya temple controversy is like the Ayodhya controversy. It was a controversy over a sacred spot, which had meaning for people from different religions. But the Bodh Gaya temple controversy got resolved through negotiations over a long period of time.
right, as you said, almost
It's
about
a
70
very
years.
interesting, a very interesting episode in our history. The lesson I draw from that episode, Mini, is that all sacred places in India are liminal in nature. They are sacred for all people. Ayodhya, important to India, to Hindus, of course. It is also important to Muslims. It is important to Buddhists. Once upon a time, before in the early part of the first millennium, all places, sacred places in India, draw people of all faiths. So fighting over sacred places, uh, my personal view is, we should recognize the liminality. Like in Bodh Gaya, you had Hindus going to Bodh Gaya, and you also had Buddhists from across the world coming to the Mahabodhi temple.
Mm.
But Edwin Arnold saw this as as blasphemous. He saw this as a desecration of the sacredness of Buddhism.
Right.
Somewhat like a Hindutva activist. Today,
Right, right. But what is also interesting is that you referred to it in this conversation, but for all Edwin Arnold's passion for Indology, or Buddhism, the sacred scriptures, the Sanskrit verses, he was very ambivalent to the freedom struggle. He never referred to it, and I go back to his work on revisiting India when he comes back in the 1880s and he's traveling through India, 100 days in India, and he's traveling through it and he's sending his dispatches. He just ignores all that is happening in the freedom movement. How do you kind of reconcile that?
He had no sympathy whatsoever with India's political aspirations. In fact, he met Dadabhai Naoroji, in December of 1885, a few days before the Indian National Congress was formally announced. He met Ellen Octavian Hume, he met William Wedderburn, he met K.T. Telang, he met Firozshah Mehta, he met Dadabhai Naoroji in Bombay. 20 days before the Indian National Congress establishment was announced. He had nothing to say. I mean, he had no, and Dadabhai Naoroji was in London. He spent years in London. With no contact between him and Edwin Arnold on Indian political aspirations. Absolutely. On that score, Shashi is right. I mean, he belongs, he had no sympathy. He knew that British rule in India would have to end at some stage.
Right.
And he wrote about it in his works, that at some stage, the British will have to go, but the British should go with their head held high. And after having brought this ancient and glorious civilization into the modern scientific era, so he was a great votary of the railways, a great votary of the telegraph, a great votary of education, science education, English education, and so on. So, yeah, I mean, he had no sympathy with Indian political aspirations. He was not a great, but he was an extraordinary popularizer of India's cultural traditions. That's right. What, it's curiously ambivalent. It's a contradictory perspective.
Because it is quite amazing that a man like Mahatma Gandhi, who was also well versed in the Bhagavad Gita and the Indian scriptures, I mean, like most people would be of his generation, would turn to a song celestial to be inspired every day, which I find quite amazing, because it's the fact that even people who knew about Buddhism really appreciated that. And the Light of Asia continues to be quite a well translated, commented upon, studied kind of text even today, isn't it? I mean, so it has kind of retained its appeal in that context.
Absolutely. It's got translated into every Indian language, including Sindhi, Punjabi, Tamil, Kannada, Malayalam, Bengali, one can understand, and Hindi. But Sindhi, Punjabi, one of the first translation into any Indian language was Bengali. And then we had Marathi, then Telugu, then Tamil, then Malayalam, Kannada, Odia, every Indian language, Assamese. You name the language and you'll have a translation. In fact, 3-4 years ago, I discovered a Bhojpuri translation. Although Bhojpuri is not one of the
most natural, actually. It should be the most natural.
22 languages schedule, but there is an Urdu translation. I found an Urdu translation. So it's been translated into all the languages in our 8th schedule. Not all the languages, all the main languages. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's got translated because people are interested in the Buddha. People want to know about the Buddha. And even today, meaning every year in Colombo, there is an organization called the YMBA, Young Men's Buddhist Association. They have an annual elocution contest. The annual elocution contest is called the Light of Asia contest. And children from schools in Sri Lanka come and participate in this day-long, day or 2 days, I think it's 2 days, contest, where they recite their favorite lines from the poem,
Hmm.
and they are judged for their elocution skills. And one of the reasons why the YMBA has continued this tradition, which started in 1920, it's been going on for 100 years now, is that they want the message of the Buddha, to remain active and to continue to resonate. And it's called the Light of Asia Elocution Contest.
Right. It brings me to my last question. You started this journey of rediscovering the light of Asia and Edwin Arnold because you had read it as a teen, and you got into this journey. What was the most mind-blowing fact? Because what is amazing is people like you, when you are looking deep into a subject, you're also pulling out so much of new material. And that's what this forum is all about, to invite people like you, authors and researchers who are working on new aspects, and giving a fresh new perspective on so many things that we take for granted. So I'm really curious to know, what was it that really was jaw-dropping for you?
The greatest jaw-popping thing for me, Minnie, was to discover Edwin Arnold's great-grandchildren in Bhopal.
Wow.
And the last chapter is called Edwin Arnold's great-grandchildren in Bhopal. And, I'll spare you the long story how I discovered this. But I discovered a series of his grandchildren, and the children's names are the grandchildren, great-grandchildren. Mohammed Michael Arnold, Firoz Arnold, Nahid Arnold Ali, Farzana Arnold Siddiqui, and Fauzia Arnold Raza. These are the 6 great-grandchildren of Edwin Arnold, and they are living in Bhopal. And for me, that was a piece of absolute, I was dumbfounded. I discovered them, through a long process. I had written in the book. And that itself was a mystery. And, I cracked that mystery. So, in the midst of the COVID pandemic, to crack the mystery digitally, it required sleuthing skills of a very high order. And I discovered this wonderfully syncretic names. Mohammed Michael Arnold.
But did you get in touch with them? Did you tell them?
Yes, I couldn't meet them because of COVID-19, but I spoke to them. I spoke to them on the phone. I had conversations with them. We shared a lot of, they had some material. They didn't have too much material. Edwin Arnold's son, Channing Arnold, became the tutor to the Bhopal royal family in the 1920s. He married a local Muslim lady. He got murdered in Sultanpur in 1937. He had 2 children. His daughter was adopted by the local missionaries, and his son was adopted by a noble family in Bhopal. So the daughter was, she became Grace Arnold, went off to London. The son became Rafiq Arnold, settled down in Bhopal. And these names I read out to you are, the descendants of Rafiq. So Rafiq, who is the son of Channing, who is the son of Edwin. So Channing Arnold is what William Dalrymple would call a white mogul, right? He's a white man who married a local Muslim lady. And there's a wonderful photograph I have, of Grace Arnold coming and looking at the place where Channing Arnold is buried in Sultanpur, where he was actually killed in 1937. So to me, that was the most mind-blowing part. Absolutely, to discover, flesh and blood, living not in England, but living in Bhopal.
Right. But what a wonderful journey it must have been, also because it was written mostly during the COVID period, the pandemic period?
I started writing this on the 23rd of March. I started researching this on the 23rd of March, and it came out on the 7th of June. So, it was entirely during the COVID period. I didn't stir out of my house.
But undoubtedly, it was a lifetime of learning around this.
I accessed archives all over the world, in England, in Moscow, in Germany, in India, Oxford, Cambridge. I must have accessed at least about 25 to 30 archives, all digitally. All, I got all my material through email, through accessing digitally. I didn't have to go anywhere to write this book.
Wonderful, isn't it? This that makes work from home, gives it a totally new dimension. But many thanks for joining us. And I have to ask you, what is your next book? Because you have been very prolific, a wide range of. Have you even thought of it or not yet?
No, I haven't thought about it. I'm just relaxing for a while.
Okay, but I'm going to be sending you a LHI Circle membership, and I hope to see a lot of you on our discussion.
Very enjoyable.
Really enjoyed it.
Show the book because the cover is beautiful.
Yeah, it is.
So it's a very nice, it's a very peace-loving cover.
Yes, and God knows we need it.
And there's a very nice photograph in the back cover. It's a historic photograph. It's Zhou Enlai, Nehru, Dalai Lama, and Panchen Lama.
Oh wow!
A rare photograph of all of them taken together in Rashtrapati Bhavan in December of 1956. When this 2500th anniversary of Buddha's birth, death, and enlightenment. This was taken in Rashtrapati Bhavan. It's an extraordinary photograph.
And it's got this book, by the way, also has a foreword from the Dalai Lama himself.
Yeah, so. And of course, I mean, for me, the most special part of the book is the beginning, is not the ending, the ending where I discover Edwin Arnold's great-grandchildren in Bhopal, but the beginning which has a beautiful, beautiful foreword by His Holiness the Dalai Lama.
Wonderful. Many thanks for joining us. Congratulations on the book and all the very best.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your time.
We'll be in touch.
Yes, absolutely. And I must thank all our attendees and also tell them that we've got two very interesting pieces lined up for you. This Saturday, we have a lovely film on the Mughal hunt. We have Dr. Rachel Parekh, who will be taking us through a journey of discovery to look at the beautiful art pieces from the Mughal and Rajput world. That's coming up for you on Saturday. And on the coming Wednesday, we have historian Swapna Little taking us through Delhi, unseen Delhi. And I would really urge you to attend it. I have had the privilege and pleasure of spending a lot of time with Swapna in Delhi, in the bylanes of Delhi. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion where she will take us through the story of the making of Delhi. And that's going to be very fascinating. So do join us for this. And of course, we have William Dalrymple coming on the 1st of September to talk about the situation in Afghanistan and also his book, The Return of the King. So a lot of great people lined up for you. Many thanks. And here's to really widening this community and this platform to get more and more interesting conversations like these going. Goodbye.
Bye, Minnie.
Bye. See you.